23rd of December, 1944, 07 hours and 41 minutes. Northeastern sector of Bastogne, Belgium. Captain Robert Hayes pressed the transmission button for the 17th time in 40 minutes, his breath forming small clouds in the frozen air of the communications bunker. Baker 2-3, respond. Baker 2-3, confirm position. Only static. Then, at precisely 07 hours and 43 minutes, the static ceased. Not faded, not diminished. Ceased. Complete silence. Perfect, impossible silence. Hayes felt his stomach drop. In 2 years of combat operations, he had heard interference, jamming, equipment failure, enemy broadcasts, atmospheric distortion. He had never heard this. Absolute void. Technical Sergeant William Morrison, the unit's most experienced radio operator with over 3,000 hours of communications duty, leaned forward and checked every connection, every tube, every circuit. "Sir," Morrison whispered, his voice barely audible. "Lee, the equipment is functioning perfectly. Signal strength is normal. Atmospheric conditions are ideal. There should be something. Anything. Even if Baker 2-3's radio was destroyed, we'd hear battlefield noise, German traffic, something." Hayes stared at the radio set, watching the needle on the signal meter hold steady in the green zone, indicating perfect transmission capability, while the speaker produced nothing but that terrible, complete silence. Had not know in that frozen December morning was that he was witnessing the moment when silence itself became a weapon more devastating than any artillery barrage, more decisive than any tactical maneuver, and more terrifying than any enemy attack. He was listening to the sound of 93 men making an impossible choice, and in the next 72 hours, that silence would spread like a contagion through 17 separate American positions, creating a pattern so disturbing that it would reach the highest levels of Allied command, forcing a complete reassessment of everything they thought they understood about the German offensive. Constantly, creating a symphony of tactical coordination that military planners had spent years perfecting. Intelligence officers estimated that American forces maintained contact with forward positions 97% of operational time. Communication failures were rare, brief, and almost always attributable to equipment malfunction or enemy action. The system worked, according to Major General Thomas Bradford, Chief Signals Officer for the sector. Our communications network is the FRE. Nest military achievement of this war. Every unit, every platoon, every squad can reach command within seconds. We have redundancy, we have reliability, we have absolute confidence in our ability to maintain contact. Lieutenant Colonel James Patterson, responsible for communications doctrine, wrote in an August operations report, "The enemy's greatest disadvantage is their inferior communications capability. While they rely on runners and landlines that we can cut, we operate with mobile radio, networks that provide real-time tactical flexibility. This advantage alone accounts for our operational superiority." The numbers supported this confidence. American forces deployed over 43,000 radio sets across the European theater. Daily transmission volume exceeded 2 million individual messages. Response time between forward units and command averaged under 3 minutes. But beneath this impressive efficiency, a troubling pattern had begun to emerge in isolated incidents that few noticed and fewer understood. Went silent for 6 hours during a critical German counterattack. No explanation was ever recorded. The incident was attributed to equipment failure, though recovered logs showed the radio functioned perfectly throughout. On the 27th of October, a forward aid station near Aachen ceased all transmissions for 14 hours. Medical personnel later reported they could hear German units moving within 200 meters of their position. Speaking above a whisper would have been suicide. Transmitting would have been certain death. These isolated incidents shared a common element that no one had yet articulated. In each case, silence was not a failure of communication, but a deliberate choice. A tactical decision made by men who understood that sometimes the most important message is the absence of any message at all. Inevitable Allied victory. Suddenly, American units found themselves surrounded, isolated, desperately outnumbered, fighting not for advancement but for survival. And in this new reality, the carefully constructed communications network that had been celebrated as a triumph of military efficiency became something else entirely. A liability, a beacon, a death sentence for anyone who dared use it. much complete context now, understanding what that impossible silence truly meant. Baker 2-3, commanded by First Lieutenant Michael Richardson, consisted of 83 men holding a critical road junction 4 kilometers northeast of the main Bastogne perimeter. Their position controlled access to 3 separate supply routes. German forces needed that junction. Richardson's orders were explicit. Hold the position, maintain regular contact every 30 minutes, report all enemy activity IME. Immediately. For the first 18 hours after German forces had encircled Bastogne, Richardson had maintained perfect communications discipline. Every 30 minutes, precisely on schedule, his transmissions came through. Baker 2-3, position secure, no contact. Then, at 0711 on the 23rd, his scheduled transmission never came. 30 minutes later, at 0741, still nothing. And then, at 0743, that perfect, impossible silence that made yes, understand something had gone catastrophically wrong. Eert, weapons ready, watching German forces move within 50 meters of their concealed positions, barely breathing, absolutely silent, making a choice that would save their lives, but shatter every assumption about military communications. Infantry, at least 2 companies, possibly 3, moving in tactical formation directly past his position. They were searching for something. They knew American forces were in this area. They had been probing, investigating, calling out in English, "Americans, surrender. You are surrounded." Richardson's radio operator, Corporal David Martinez, whispered so quietly that Richardson had to lean within inches to hear him. "Sir, command is calling us. 17 attempts. They think we're destroyed." Richardson nodded, said nothing. Watched German soldiers walk within 20 meters of their position, close enough to hear if anyone inside spoke above a whisper, close enough to investigate any sound, any movement, any transmission. Martinez understood. He carefully, silently, disconnected the speaker from the radio set, leaving only the signal meter active. The transmissions from command continued, the needle jumping with each attempt to contact them, but no sound emerged. Perfect silence. Technical Sergeant Robert Klein, squad leader for 2nd Squad, watched through a crack in the stone wall as German troops established a temporary command post less than 30 meters away. He could hear their conversations, their laughter, their casual confidence. They were not expecting resistance in this location. They had swept through here yesterday, found nothing, marked it as clear. Klein's men were arranged throughout the ruined structure, each one frozen in position, barely breathing. Reese, flees ready, but understanding that firing a single shot would bring overwhelming enemy response. Private First Class James Cooper, youngest member of the unit at 19 years old, had been in the middle of writing a letter home when the German forces had approached. The letter remained on his lap, pencil still in his hand, unfinished, as he watched enemy soldiers walk past carrying equipment, ammunition, supplies in quantities that made his stomach sink. Corporal Thomas Wright, the unit's most experienced soldier with combat service dating back to North Africa, recognized what he was seeing. Not a patrol, not a probe, but a major logistics operation. The Germans were moving massive quantities of material through this exact position, using the road junction that Baker 2-3 was supposed to be denying them. Wright caught Richardson's eye, made a subtle gesture indicating the volume of enemy activity, saw Richardson's barely perceptible nod of understanding. They were witnessing something critically important, but reporting it would require breaking silence, and breaking silence would mean death, the entire battle. But transmitting that information would reveal their position to enemy forces that outnumbered them at least 6-1, probably more. Any transmission would be suicide. The radio signal would pinpoint their location within seconds. German direction-finding equipment was efficient, accurate, deadly. Richardson had seen the results. Units that transmitted from concealed positions were located and destroyed within minutes. So he made the only choice he could make. He caught Mart. Inez's eye made a slashing gesture across his throat. Universal military signal. Maintain radio silence. Complete, absolute, total silence. No transmissions, no matter what. Martinez nodded, understanding the implications. Command would assume they were destroyed. No reinforcements would be sent. No relief would be attempted. They were choosing to become ghosts, to cease to exist in the communications network that defined military operations. They would be alone, forgotten, presumed dead. Arrow 817. Captain Hayes informed his commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel David Morrison, that Baker 2-3 was presumed lost. Morrison, a career officer with 23 years of service, stared at the communications log, seeing the pattern of attempted contacts, all unanswered. "Equipment failure?" he asked. Hayes shook his head. "Negative, sir. We're receiving clearly from units on both sides of their position. Baker 4 and Baker 7 are transmitting normally. The silence is specific to Baker 2-3. It's not atmospheric, not technical. Sir, they're gone." Morrison considered this. Understanding the implications, Baker 2-3's position controlled critical terrain. If the Germans held that junction, they could move forces and supplies through that sector unopposed. "Recommend artillery strike on the position," Morrison said quietly. "If we've lost it, deny it to the enemy." Hayes felt something twist in his stomach. 83 men, possibly still alive, possibly captured, calling artillery on their last known position. But Morrison was right. Tactically, strategically, it was the correct decision. "Yes, sir," Hayes replied. "Coordinates are already plotted. Fire mission can be executed within 20 minutes. Morrison nodded, then paused. Something about the silence bothered him. It was too complete, too absolute. "Wait," he said. "Give them until noon. If we haven't heard anything by 1200 hours, we'll hit the position. But something about this feels wrong." Tor immediately attempted contact. "Charlie 17, complete your report." "Charlie 17, respond." Nothing. Perfect silence. Mitchell checked his equipment, confirmed signal strength, verified that other units in the sector were transmitting normally. Charlie 17 had simply vanished from the communications network. Gone. As if they had never existed. 3. 2 ceased transmissions at 0831. Dog 5. 5 went silent at 0849. Baker 9. 3 stopped responding at 0902. Fox 2. 8 dropped off the network at 0911. Easy. 7-7 transmitted their last message at 0918 and then nothing. Each unit had been maintaining regular communications. Each had been reporting normal or near normal conditions. And then, within seconds, complete silence. No distress calls. No rapport. TS of enemy contact. No requests for support. Just silence. Perfect, absolute, impossible silence. Very position had been maintaining regular contact until the moment they went silent, and none of them had transmitted any indication of enemy action before disappearing from the network. Foster had been a signals officer for 11 years. He had managed communications during amphibious assaults, airborne operations, armored advances. He had dealt with equipment failures, atmospheric interference, enemy jamming, operator error. He had never seen anything like this. "It's not equipment," he told Colonel Morrison. "It's not jamming, it's not enemy action in the conventional sense. Sir, these units are choosing to go silent. They're deliberately ceasing communications. Transmission would compromise their location. They're so close to enemy forces that even a brief radio message would get them killed. They're choosing survival over communications. They're choosing to become invisible." Morrison felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December cold. "How many men total in these silent positions?" Foster consulted his roster. "As of 0930, we have no contact with 13 separate positions. Combined strength, approximately 470. Men?" Morrison absorbed this number. 470 men, all silent, all presumed lost. Except Foster was suggesting they might not be lost. They might be alive, watching, waiting, deliberately choosing to vanish from the very network that was supposed to keep them connected and protected. 2 hours since their last transmission, German forces continued to move through the area in steady streams. Richardson's men remained frozen in their concealed positions, cramped, cold, desperate to move, to stretch, to cough, to make any sound that would relieve the psychological pressure of forced silence. Private First Class James Cooper felt a cough building in his throat, triggered by the cold and the brick dust that filled the ruined building. He pressed his hand over his mouth, suppressing, nung-it, feeling his eyes water with the effort, knowing that a single cough could draw attention, could trigger investigation, could kill them all. The cough subsided, but his throat burned with the effort of suppression. Corporal David Martinez, the radio operator, watched the signal meter continue to jump as command attempted contact. 23 attempts now, 24, 25, each one a reminder that their commanders thought they were dead, that no help was coming, that they were alone. Nay, Martinez found himself counting the seconds between attempts, finding a strange comfort in the rhythm. Command was still trying. Someone up there still hoped, even if they couldn't answer. Ting squads to investigate specific locations, including the ruined buildings where Baker 2-3 was concealed. Klein watched Richardson's face, saw the calculation happening there. They were about to be discovered. Within minutes, German infantry would be searching this structure. Fighting was inevitable. But if they fired first, if they initiated contact, they might achieve enough surprise to break through the enemy perimeter and escape. Richardson made a decision. He held up his hand. Spread. 5 minutes. They would wait 5 more minutes. If the German search reached their position, they would fight, but they would not break silence until absolutely necessary. A radio message that Klein couldn't hear. The officer's posture changed. He called back the search teams, issued new orders, and within 90 seconds, the entire German force was moving out, heading south, apparently responding to some urgent development in another sector. Richardson watched them go, hardly believing what he was seeing. The temporary command post was dismantled, equipment loaded onto vehicles, and within 10 minutes of what would have been their discovery, the German forces departed completely, leaving the area silent, except for the wind through broken walls and the distant sound of artillery. 88 intelligence debrief. Have observed significant enemy logistics operation. Over. The response was instantaneous. Captain Hayes's voice came through the speaker. Shocked, disbelieving. Baker 2-3, confirm identity, authenticate. Richardson provided the proper codes, confirmed his identity, and listened as Hayes tried to process what he was hearing. Baker 2-3, you were presumed lost. What is your situation? Richardson looked around at his men, seeing the exhaustion, the the lingering tension in every face. Command, we maintained deliberate radio silence due to extreme proximity of enemy forces. 83 men, all effective. Position still secure. We have critical intelligence. Request staff officer for debrief. A drawing, the decision to go silent, the hours of watching enemy logistics operations move through their position, the near discovery, the unexpected withdrawal. Foster listened, taking notes, asking detailed questions, and gradually understanding the profound implications of what Richardson was describing. You made the right call, Foster said finally. Transmission would have killed you all, but we thought you were destroyed. We almost called artillery on your position. You were 3 hours away from being hit by our own guns. Richardson absorbed this, understanding how close they had come to death from friendly fire. Sir, we couldn't risk transmission. We chose survival. We chose silence. Foster nodded, but his mind was already racing ahead. Lieutenant, you're not the only one. 13 positions went silent this morning. We thought we'd lost nearly 500 men. If they all made the same choice you did, if they're all still out there, watching, alive, then we have a massive intelligence problem and a tactical crisis. Because if our own forces are choosing to go dark rather than risk transmission, it means the enemy has created conditions where our communications network has become a liability instead of an asset. Next 6 hours, communications officers attempted systematic contact with every silent position. The results were shocking and unprecedented. Of the 13 positions that had gone silent, 11 responded when contact was attempted during periods of apparent reduced enemy activity. 2 positions remained silent, and subsequent investigation confirmed they had been overrun and destroyed. But 11 out of 13 had made the same choice as Richardson, deliberate radio silence to avoid detecting. Combined, those 11 positions represented 416 men who had chosen to become invisible, to drop out of the communications network, to rely on tactical judgment rather than institutional procedure. They had chosen survival over doctrine. In on attack. We needed to report this, but we could hear German radio direction-finding teams actively searching for our transmissions. They were calling out coordinates, trying to triangulate our position. If we'd transmitted, they'd have located us in seconds. So we went dark. We watched. We documented everything. And when they moved out for their attack, We transmitted warning to the units they were targeting. Our silence gave those units 47 minutes of advance warning. Our transmission, at the right moment, when the enemy couldn't respond, saved lives. Silence was the most important intelligence we could provide. We told command exactly when to listen by choosing exactly when to speak. Ours to maintain regular contact, he argued in a heated staff meeting on the evening of the 23rd. They made individual tactical decisions that left command with no understanding of the actual situation. We were planning operations based on the assumption these positions were destroyed. We almost committed forces to retake positions that were never lost. This cannot be tolerated. Radio discipline means maintaining contact, not abandoning it when it becomes inconvenient. Major Foster Cowan, teared immediately. Inconvenient? These men were surrounded by overwhelming enemy forces. Transmission meant death. They chose to stay alive, to continue observing, to provide intelligence when it was tactically feasible. They showed initiative, tactical judgment, and courage. We should be learning from this, not punishing it. Requiring tactical flexibility. Patterson represented the institutional view that communications networks enabled command and control, that breaking contact was equivalent to breaking the chain of command itself. Foster represented the pragmatic view that survival and mission accomplishment sometimes required violating procedure, that rigid adherence to communications doctrine could be as deadly as complete communications failure. Colonel Morrison listened to both arguments, understanding the truth lay somewhere between them. The doctrine assumes that maintaining contact is always possible and always advantageous, he said finally. But these men have demonstrated that in certain tactical situations, silence is more valuable than speech. The enemy can't locate what doesn't transmit. They can't destroy what they can't find. Silence became camouflage. Silence became a weapon. We need to understand this, formalize it, make it part of our doctrine rather than treating it as a violation. But the phenomenon continued to spread. On the 24th of December, 18 more positions went deliberately silent at various times throughout the day. On the 25th, 23 positions chose silence over transmission. By the 26th, communications officers had stopped counting the silent positions as failures or casualties and had begun tracking them as a new category: tactical radio silence, deliberate and temporary. The American Communications Network, which had been designed for constant connectivity, had evolved into something more sophisticated, a system where silence itself carried meaning, where the absence of transmission became a message more powerful than any words. Intelligence officers began analyzing the patterns, discovering that silent positions often preceded enemy movements, that the timing of resumed transmissions correlated with enemy withdrawals, that the decision to go silent was itself valuable intelligence indicating extreme enemy IT inactivity. Valuable than any report we could have sent, because the enemy never knew we were there. They showed us everything: their routes, their strength, their supplies, their plans. They showed us because they thought no one was watching. Silence made us invisible. Invisibility made us deadly. When our artillery hit their supply column 2 hours after we reported, after they thought they were safe behind their lines, the enemy learned what we already knew. Sometimes the most important message is the one you don't send until the perfect moment. RD December. Numerous American positions have ceased transmissions for extended periods, sometimes hours, sometimes days. Our direction-finding teams report difficulty locating these silent units. When transmissions resume, they are brief, tactical, and cease again immediately. The Americans appear to have adapted their communications doctrine to counter our intercept and direction-finding capabilities. This adaptation demonstrates tactical flexibility we had not previously observed. Recommend reassessment of American communications vulnerabilities. LIST. Evolutionary. It emerged from the tactical reality that in certain situations connection meant death and isolation meant survival. And once discovered, the tactic spread not through formal channels, but through informal networks, through soldiers talking to other soldiers, through shared understanding that silence could be a weapon. Analysis of the silent position phenomenon. The statistics were remarkable. 67 separate American positions had maintained tactical radio silence for periods ranging from 2 hours to 53 hours. Combined, these positions represented over 2,000 men who had chosen to vanish from the communications network. Of those 67 positions, 63 survived intact and provided valuable intelligence upon resuming contact. 4 positions were destroyed, but post-battle analysis indicated they had been overrun, not because of radio silence, but despite it, caught by enemy forces that discovered them through visual observation or informants rather than radio intercepts. The survival rate for silent positions was 94%, compared to 71% for positions that maintained standard communications protocols during the same period. The difference was statistically significant and tactically profound. Silence saved lives. The men who had experienced enforced silence was complex and long-lasting. Corporal David Martinez, the radio operator from Baker 2-3, was interviewed by a military psychiatrist 6 weeks after the events. The hardest part wasn't the fear, Martinez explained. It was the isolation. We chose to disconnect from everything that connected us to our own side. We became ghosts. We knew command thought we were dead. We knew no help would come. We knew that if we died in that silence, no one would know how or when or why. That's a different kind of fear than combat. It's existential. You're choosing to cease to exist in every way except physically. And when we finally transmitted again, when we reconnected, it felt like being resurrected, like we'd been dead and came back to life. Some of the men said they could never forget what that silence felt like, the weight of it, the absolute quality of it. At position Easy 77, described the experience differently. It was liberating, he said in his debriefing. Once we made the decision to go dark, we stopped worrying about schedules, about required reports, about maintaining contact. We focused entirely on survival and observation. We became hunters instead of soldiers. We watched the enemy like predators watching prey, knowing they couldn't see us, couldn't hear us, couldn't find us. When we finally transmitted, we had 41 hours of enemy intelligence compiled, organized, ready to report. Every vehicle we'd seen, every unit identification, every movement pattern. Our silence let us see everything. Our report let command understand everything. That's worth 41 hours of being a ghost. Decentralized silence was more effective than networked connectivity. A classified report issued on the 15th of January 1945 formalized tactical radio silence as an accepted procedure. The report, authored by Major Foster with input from dozens of officers and soldiers who had experienced the silent position phenomenon, established guidelines for when and how units could choose to cease transmissions, when enemy forces were in immediate proximity, when transmission would CL. Early compromise position security, when intelligence value of continued observation exceeded the value of real-time reporting, when resumption of contact could be accomplished without undue risk. The report concluded with a statement that represented a fundamental shift in military communications doctrine. Silence is not the absence of communication, but a form of communication itself. The decision not to transmit, when made with tactical judgment and clear intent, conveys information as valuable as any report. Units that choose tactical silence are not abandoning their responsibility to communicate, but are fulfilling that responsibility in a way that maximizes survival, effectiveness, and ultimate mission accomplishment. During silence periods, in procedures for resuming contact after extended silence, the rigid doctrine of constant connectivity evolved into something more sophisticated, a flexible system that recognized silence itself as a tactical tool, as valuable in certain circumstances as the most detailed report. The paradox was elegant and profound. Sometimes the best way to communicate was to stop communicating, to become invisible in the electromagnetic spectrum, to let the enemy's uncertainty and ignorance become weapons against them. Message is the one you choose not to send. Every year, on the 23rd of December, veterans of the Bastogne campaign gather at the site. They stand in silence for precisely 2 hours and 32 minutes, the exact duration of Baker 2-3's initial radio silence. No speeches are given, no words are spoken, just silence. Perfect, absolute, meaningful silence. And in that silence they honor not just the men who made an impossible choice in 1944, but the profound lesson T.I.'s men taught, that in extremis, when survival and mission conflict with doctrine and procedure, when connection means death and isolation means life, the courage to choose silence, to vanish, to become ghosts in the network, can be as heroic as any act of combat. Vulnerability. The inability to recognize when silence itself is the message, when absence is the presence that matters most, when the decision to disconnect is the connection that saves everything. The men at Bastogne discovered this truth not through theory or doctrine, but through survival necessity. They learned that silence could be camouflage, that invisibility could be strength, that the ghost in the network could be more powerful than the node that constantly broadcasts its existence. And learning this, they revealed something fundamental about communication itself, that what we choose not to say, the messages we deliberately withhold, the moments when we step back from connectivity and embrace isolation, these too are forms of communication. Perhaps the most powerful forms because they force those who listen to confront not our words but our absence, not our presence but our void. Acre 2-3, who had drafted casualty reports assuming their destruction, who had recommended artillery strikes on their position, kept a small note in his personal effects for the rest of his life. It was a message Richardson had written on a scrap of paper and handed to Hayes during the intelligence debrief. Silence is not the end of communication. It is communication at its most pure. When words would kill, silence speaks. When connection means death, absence means life. We did not abandon in our duty to communicate. We fulfilled it in the only way that let us survive to communicate again. Sometimes the message is the silence itself. Hayes never forgot those words, never forgot the lesson of the silent positions, never forgot the moment when he realized that the terrible, perfect silence he had heard at 0743 on the 23rd of December, 1944, was not the sound of death, but the sound of men choosing life in the only way available to them, by becoming invisible, by becoming silent, by becoming ghosts who would return to speak when silence had accomplished what words never could.